Good day, everyone. I'm Louise Holden, VP of Membership at GARP, and I would like to thank you for joining us for this virtual meeting on nature risks in the boardroom. It's co-hosted by our GARP Toronto and Montreal chapters with the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, the Institute for Sustainable Finance, and the Taskforce on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures as part of Canada Climate Week XChange. Today's meeting is underwritten by the GARP chapter programme and funded through member dues. If you are not already an individual member of GARP, I encourage you to become one. You'll have access to full member benefits while supporting your local chapter and the global mission of your professional association. A few housekeeping tips before we start. If your screen freezes at any time, press F5 to refresh it. You can type in questions into the Q&A box, and we'll talk more about this shortly, but it is an interactive session, so please do type in questions. You can download the slides and other resources from the related content box to the left of your console, and you can resize any window by holding down and dragging the bottom right-hand corner. So a couple of a short introduction to GARP for those who don't know. GARP is the leading global association for risk managers dedicated to the advancement of the profession through education, research, and the promotion of best practices. Our global network of 29 local communities, known as GARP chapters, provide an opportunity to connect with peers, share best practice, and learn something new. Each of our chapters hosts 2 to 3 meetings every year, such as the one today, and GARP individual members have priority registration to attend any chapter meeting worldwide for free. We also welcome guests and lots of new faces, so if you are travelling, please do check out our website, garp.com, and join us at an upcoming local event. In addition to our chapter meetings, GARP supports our members with resources that help elevate knowledge and professional skills at every stage of their career. From practice-based educational resources, access to premium content on multiple channels, such as industry surveys, white papers, and our member multimedia library, which is an archive of on-demand webcasts, event recordings, and chapter meeting presentations, such as today. So you can find more detail of our content on our website, including lots more content from our GARP Risk Institute on climate risk. And if you are thinking of joining GARP, just a quick note, if you're considering registering for one of our globally recognised professional certification programmes, such as the Financial Risk Manager designation or our Sustainability and Climate Risk Certificate or Risk in AI exam, as a first-time GARP candidate, you'll receive a one-time complimentary membership. So at this point, I'd like to pass over to Clara, who is going to moderate today's session. And Clara, would you like to introduce yourself and our panel? Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Louise, and welcome to you all. Good afternoon, or indeed good morning or good evening if you're joining from abroad. I'm delighted to welcome you to this Canada Climate Week XChange webinar, Nature Risks and the Boardroom, How to Avoid Lawsuits and Protect Margins. My name is Clara Yoshem. I'm a communications consultant with the Commonwealth Climate and Law Initiative, or CCLI, and I will be the moderator today. Few words about CCLI. We're a legal research organization that works to clarify what corporate law and fiduciary duties actually require when it comes to climate and nature. So in short, we're here to help boards, investors, and their teams understand what the law expects of them and then what's at stake if they miss the mark. So to achieve this, we've published a number of legal opinions. You may already be familiar with our Canada Legal Opinion. If you're not, I strongly encourage you to check it out. You should be able to have access the link in the box for additional content. And then we also have our Global Director's Duties Navigator that is coming out very soon. And that's a fantastic tool. It's a global tool that we publish with the Climate Governance Initiative. The next version will be released very soon. Again, head over to the box on the side where you've got the link to sign up if you'd like to be notified. So before we begin, first of all, I would like to thank those who've made today's events possible. So firstly, big thanks to our co-hosts, GARP, and to their Toronto and Montreal chapters, and to our partners at the Institute for Sustainable Finance and the TNFD for supporting this event. And finally, a sincere thanks also to the organizers of Canada Climate Week XChange. This entire week features fantastic sessions on Canada's unique nature and climate challenges, and I strongly encourage you to explore the rest of the program if you haven't already done so. As Louise mentioned on housekeeping, we have a Q&A segment at the end, so do stick around until the end of the session, and you can submit your questions to our panelists at any time, and then we'll gather them and answer them later on. And we'll also have polling questions to really understand where all of you are coming from. We've got a diverse registrants list. So yes, please do answer the questions. And actually, I'll begin with the first polling question, which is gauging your respective awareness of directors' legal duties to address nature risks. So you've got a few options: very familiar, somewhat familiar, aware but unclear, not familiar. Please reply. It helps us to understand where you're at in your journey. And before we turn to our brilliant panelists, I did look at the registration list and noticed that we're joined today by participants from Canada's largest pension funds, major banks, insurers. We also have a mix of managers, board, C-suite members, some lawyers, and participants from Canada, of course, but also Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Caribbean. So I think this diversity tells us something very important, which is that nature is relevant to us all. And indeed, nature-related risks are not environmental side issues, but they are financial, operational, legal, and strategic issues that affect most, if not all, sectors of our economy. And we're meeting today, as you'll all know, just a few days after COP. And what personally struck me is the physical environment really became a part of the story. So you may have seen reports of sessions held in extreme heat, rooms were flooded by rain, travel disrupted by storms, and there was even a fire that forced delegates to evacuate. And I think these are all symbols of the very stark physical risks deriving from climate change and nature loss. And COP30 was heralded as a shift from ambition to implementation. But I think that the expectation of countries to show how they're managing climate and nature risks is rising for businesses and boards in parallel. So before we start, why does nature belong on the board agenda? I could think of many, many reasons, but I'll summarize three. The first is the losses are very real. So Canada experienced 8.5 billion in weather and nature-related insured losses in 2024, which is triple the year before. Secondly, Canada's economy relies on nature. We know that ecosystems provide roughly 4.9 trillion in services every year. That's pollination, water purification, flood protection, carbon storage, you name it. And these services underpin our agriculture, our infrastructure, real estate, and supply chains. And the World Economic Forum has actually warned that construction, agriculture, and food and beverages could suffer, quote unquote, significant losses from nature loss. And the impacts, they're not limited to sectors that are highly dependent on nature, they're rippling through. And finally, investors are watching and moving. So an interesting study I saw is that according to Milani, 63% of institutional investors who represent 4.5 trillion Canadian dollars in asset under management are now integrating nature into their investment decisions. So I think with all those clear signals in mind, I'll turn to our exceptional panel to help us navigate what is a novel and sometimes daunting subject, nature governance. So I'm very happy to introduce you all to Lisa DeMarco, who's a senior partner and CEO at Resilient LLP and the lead author of CCLI's Canada Legal Opinion. We're also joined by Joey Williams, who leads the TNFD's work on nature-related opportunities, and Bertrand Millot, who is head of sustainability at La Caisse and is also a board director himself. Welcome to you all. Thank you so much for being here with us, for taking the time. It's hugely appreciated. And I will turn to Lisa for the first question. I don't know if the results from the first polling have come through. Perhaps they will appear. So as we can see, the majority of you are saying you're aware but unclear, and you're not sure what is actually legally required. And that's great, because Lisa is about to answer a related question. So Lisa, your legal opinion concluded that directors have a duty to consider the risks that are related to nature under existing Canadian law. Could you please share with us some of the biggest misconceptions that you encounter from boards about what's part of their legal duties and what isn't?
Thank you so much, Clara. It's a real pleasure to be here with the panel and the team. And the question is very prescient. I think there's a real misconception that nature-related risks are somehow other, outside of the basic tenet of risk and risk assessment and risk addressing in the context of basic legal duties. And we want to dispel that notion immediately and emphasize that they are, like other risks, very important and must be assessed, both in terms of the materiality of such risks from both their impact on the corporation and the corporation's long-term impact on nature. And the opinion really attempted to compile all of the data in one place to ensure that it was very easy for Canadian and, in fact, North American companies to have all the information at their fingertips to determine whether or not these risks are, in fact, foreseeable, what other financial and related corporate organizations are doing. This was very much done from existing corporate and securities related perspectives, and to look at the specific duties of directors in Canada, specifically the fiduciary duty, the duty to act in the best interest, honestly and in good faith, and with a view to the best interest of the corporation, and the duty of care, the duty to take all care, diligence, and skill that a reasonable, prudent person would take in similar circumstances, and to put those in the context of nature. And where we came out very clearly, particularly in line with the elaborating provisions of the Canadian Business Corporations Act, was that absolutely this is a risk. It is potentially a material risk, and at a minimum, corporate directors must assess which nature-related risks apply to them, and, if material, take appropriate actions to mitigate or address them. So very much business as usual when it comes to risk assessment, and no special treatment of nature-related risks. This is hardcore financial prudence. And it's very relevant because of the prevalence of the impact. So you mentioned that the World Economic Forum has assessed that greater than 50% of the global GDP is either moderately or highly dependent on nature. And a number of corporations have cumulative impacts on nature that could in fact become financially material over time. So we look at both and assess very specifically what are the duties, and concluding that there's at a minimum the duty to assess and address if material, and secondly looking at what are the impacts if you don't. And those impacts if you don't are fairly important. There are a number of related common law and statutory claims that could potentially be brought against corporations for ignoring this critical class of risk. And the paper highlights the common law related actions in negligence and related torts, and then also derivative actions that are statutorily provided for as against directors and or coming from certain classes of shareholders that may otherwise be oppressed or not have their views realized or accommodated in the context of nature-related risk. So that's at a very high level where we went with the opinion. And I do want to thank the CCLI for having the foresight to commission the opinion and to make it as easy as possible for corporate directors, for all forms of corporate employees and staff to have a shortcut to the duties and to the information that's relevant to determining what the duty is in their specific circumstances.
Thank you so much, Lisa. And yes, it's no small feat, I think, to summarize a legal opinion of this caliber in a few minutes. So thank you for having done so well. And what I really hear in terms of key takeaways is that nature is not a separate class of risk. It's very much, as you mentioned, business as usual. And then, you know, the reality, the practical consequences, it's potential lawsuits. So the legal risk is very real. I'll turn to Bertrand on the pricing of nature-related risks from an investor, but also director's perspective. So Bertrand, I'd be very curious to hear about how La Caisse has been approaching nature with regards to its own investments and stewardships. And then are you seeing any signals from markets or credit agencies on the absence or presence of a nature strategy within companies?
Hi, and thank you for having me. Hi, everybody. I think it's good to start with defining nature, and I'll make a separation between climate-related things and nature, and I'll be speaking first about that part, the non-climate aspect, which is more nascent. It doesn't mean that the two are not linked, they are. But it helps break down the issue into bits and pieces if one wants to tackle it. I would say that the way we look at this, so I'm talking about the non-climate part of nature, is there's plenty of risks. And I'm speaking about it as an investor, but we expect the same kind of awareness and attitude from the part of portfolio companies or potential investments. I would split again the problem into four. There is the question of protecting nature, i.e. national parks, exclusion zones, etc. It's not something that we can invest in at this time. The questions of biodiversity credit and all that is immature, and so we're not invested in that. It's tricky. There is the question of avoiding the macro aggressions on nature, i.e. the deleterious effects of deforestation, whether it's for cattle, for palm oil, or just mining. Those are important aspects, and those need to be stopped yesterday, and investors have a huge role to play. As a board director, this could be down in your supply chain. They are in Europe. There is now laws that are likely to happen. Okay, there's delays, but likely to really create a huge financial risk if you don't take care of that in your supply chain. There is the part which is related to agriculture mostly, which is what I would call the microaggression of nature. Every day, fertilizers, pesticides, more fertilizers, more pesticide, with the impact on biodiversity, soil degradation, erosion, greenhouse gases, etc., that come out of those practices. Now, those, you know, the concept of net zero food does not apply. We need food, but we need better food, and I'll be speaking a little bit about that later. But the question of how to improve this is important, and we're certainly, as an investor, involved in collaborative engagement initiatives to push companies in that area. And then there is the investing pro-nature, so pro-biodiversity. We're talking forestry, we're talking sustainable agriculture, where you're also creation of carbon credits, at some point biodiversity credits, coming back to So point number one, where we're starting to be active. We have close to $2 billion invested in this, intend to continue, but it's an important aspect to deploy capital as an investor. I think what this illustrates is that we believe that we have, there is risks, definitely. There are potential legal costs. If you're doing greenfield infrastructure and about to cover the planet or some area with concrete, be careful what you're covering with concrete. Make sure that there is nothing that is too valuable in terms of species, because at the very least, you will have legal costs, you may have lawsuits, you have a question of license to operate, project cancellation, potentially later on. So one needs to take those things into account if you're building anything new. And that's absolutely key. And so those are the aspects that, where we see risks, clear, tangible risk, downside, and when we invest pro-nature, upside potential.
Thank you so much, Bertrand. That's really helpful. As a follow-on, are there perhaps specific behaviors from boards that help build investor confidence that nature risks are managed? Are there red flags that suggest the opposite in your experience?
Yeah, I think the question is awareness and really asking oneself the right question and digging a little bit into it. It's like, yeah, it doesn't look like we're at risk. Are you so sure? Have you really asked the right questions? Have you really drilled down into your activities, considered the impact that your activities may have? Consider your dependencies also. We can come back to the climate aspects. Are you dependent on climate risk? Are you dependent on the availability of water? In your supply chain. So there needs to be a proper process within boards and for boards to ask management to go over these things. I mean, the way we see disclosure frameworks such as the TCFD or the TNFD is that they're actually quite useful tools, not only as a piece of paper with something, but the tool is in the process of writing the text, i.e. it asks the right questions. If the answer is there is no risk, there is no issue, great, write it down, but the process that leads to that writing is what matters. And this is very, very, very important. Because when you ask people to put things on paper, whether they're investment officers or a CEO or a senior management team, typically they have thought about it carefully. And you may be surprised in what you read.
That's incredibly helpful, thank you. And you've preempted the ABQ guide from the TNFD, which we'll briefly, swiftly get to in a couple of questions. But before we do that, going back to you, Lisa, on the kind of legal risks. And I think it's impossible to have a conversation about nature risks without mentioning indigenous rights because they're so closely linked. So in your legal opinion, you concluded that indigenous rights and titles, they're part of the foreseeable nature-related risks that boards must know or ought to know. What are the legal risks if boards don't integrate indigenous-related risks into their governance?
It's a very good question because Canada is unique among many jurisdictions in that Indigenous rights and the duty to consult is constitutionally protected. So we don't have as Indigenous peoples as stakeholders. We have Indigenous peoples as part of nature as rights holders. And that distinction is very, very important. And failure to consider, respect, consult with Indigenous peoples and facilitate full integration of Aboriginal rights and title into consideration of the corporation's activities and considering the corporation's activities impacts on Indigenous peoples is potentially fatal in terms of a number of initiatives specifically relating to major projects. So the duty to consult is based in the honor of the Crown, and we've seen a number of projects get held up and or not proceed based on the failure to properly consider and integrate Indigenous-related, nature-related risks into the activity. In addition, there's a very strong history of claims against corporations by Indigenous peoples for the failure to respect their constitutional rights or address their Aboriginal right and title, particularly where there's an adverse impact, cumulative or singular, cumulative being a point of emphasis, on those Indigenous rights and title. So the most recent cases have been very, very active and clear on the duty. And there have been a number of corresponding actions by Aboriginal business corporations themselves to facilitate frameworks and pathways to encourage the consideration and the addressing of Aboriginal rights and titles in relation to corporate activities.
Thank you so much. Could you, I mean, you've already done so, but in terms of claims, but could you perhaps share some steps that directors and companies can take to mitigate that legal and reputational, because there is a big reputational element, right? Their exposure, and any examples of engagement, successful engagement with Indigenous right holders and communities?
I'm happy to do that. First is understanding the overlapping territories of UN historical Indigenous communities who have been in Canada since time immemorial. Understanding the associated treaty framework that they operate in, also quite critical. And then fully understanding the large, high-level duty to consult and the specific consultation procedures and frameworks that Indigenous entities in your territory or surrounding your territory may have is sort of table stakes, the base level activity. Secondly, engaging early and often is quite critical. Seeing Indigenous rights holders as partners in development, whether that is from an equity perspective, and a good example of that is Hydro One has a policy in place where new transmission lines will not be developed without 50% equity stake of Indigenous partners. Similarly, OPG has had Indigenous-led large electricity generation projects, and more to come. And there is movement on the fossil fuel side as well. I note that Enbridge has recently established an Indigenous working group, which is not quite as far along as what we see in the power sector. Mining sector, some very good examples of Indigenous-led activities with the ACON and Martin Hill group. So a lot more happening there, particularly in the resource sectors. And I think we see the Indigenous activity increasing very significantly in the insurance sector as well. So some good examples to follow vis-a-vis the power transmission sector, and some work to be done in other sectors, but a lot to look to guide the pathway forward on Indigenous consultation, consideration of Indigenous-related, nature-related risk, including both the impacts on Indigenous communities and the dependencies related to them. So those two factors are critically important.
Thank you, Lisa. That's incredibly helpful. And again, encouraging participants to consult the opinion if you'd like more information on that. But there is also another practical resource that we're going to be touching on today, which is a guide that was published this year by the TNFD called Asking Better Questions on Nature. and it's designed to help directors and companies navigate nature risks specifically. So I'm delighted that we have Joy today with us to talk to us about the TNFD's work. Joy, could you maybe share with us some of the questions that you think are most powerful from the guide in sparking conversations with senior management in the boardroom, and that can lead to concrete action?
Great, thanks, Claire, and thanks for having us here. I will also say, given the nature of our audience today, this is Asking Better Questions for board directors. There was a second guide, Asking Better Questions, released last month, actually, I think, for asset owners and asset managers. So our audience may be interested in looking at that as well. Both guides are really aimed at getting decision useful discussions happening. And to your question about like what would be the most impactful or the most proactive questions to ask, looking at these 12 questions in the board director's guide, I will say that there is no one right answer to that. There's not like a start at number 1 and go to number 12. It's not a checklist, in other words. Asking or selecting the question to ask management really depends on kind of two things. One is meeting management where they are and then pushing them to the next step. And on that point, for example, question number 1 seems really basic. How and where does our business depend and impact on nature? That, of course, could be appropriate for any company that hasn't looked at these things before. Maybe you're in a sector where you just didn't think that nature had a huge impact on your operations. So you start with those types of questions to really get that thought process going. But equally, that question could be used with companies in sectors that maybe think about nature all the time and maybe have fallen into the trap of going, well, I'm in this sector, for example, forestry, so it's everything I do. But to, I think what Bertrand said, it's like, have you systematically gone through like your value chain, your operations, all of those things, and where they touch on nature, where there might be dependencies, positive and negative impacts, et cetera, et cetera. So you see that one question might be appropriate in different contexts, whereas a more complex question, such as number 8, which is really forward-looking, and it requires a degree of technical expertise or access to technical expertise, potentially modeling and scenarios to understand future scenarios of nature dependencies. That would not be maybe appropriate to companies who are just starting out, but would be incredibly appropriate to, say, companies who have done their initial TNFD report. And that's the question that really gets those discussions going. So that's one side of selecting the appropriate question. The other side is really the board capacity to take on that information and assess it and judge it. And in this guide, Asking Better Questions, we do talk a little bit about what answers should the boards be looking for. We also point to a number of resources that are freely available to any board director, can look these up. And of course, a lot of this education might be coming from management themselves, and arranging for board education, et cetera. So the board needs to ask questions that not only get thoughtful answers from management, but also where the board is in a position to take those questions on board, sorry for the pun, and have really fruitful discussions about how this impacts strategy. And whichever question they select, the most powerful ones are the ones that get at that why, like why is the company doing what it's doing, given this decision useful information. So yeah, no straightforward answer, Clara, as I would just say it's not a checklist. You have to really go into this with some sort of understanding and understanding of the topic, and then understanding what you want to get from management.
Thank you, Joy. I think it's a fantastic tool because, it meets the company or the board where it's at, and that's that makes it really powerful in itself. I think we've touched on the risks. We've touched on how to, start addressing them. It would be remiss of us not to talk about the challenges because, the integration of climate issues at board level, it's advanced somewhat over the past years, but I think nature remains behind the curve. And I'd like to turn back to you, Bertrand, and Joy and Lisa, please do also jump in. Could you share with us what you think are some of the most common barriers to integrating nature into governance, and any inspiring examples of how boards or management teams are overcoming these challenges?
Thank you. As I said earlier, I think you need to break the issue down into smaller pieces so that you can tackle them and really try to separate what is climate related, and climate may be due to nature loss, etc., and will have an impact on nature, and what is really more specifically the destruction or the impact on nature, more direct. So climate, I would say greenhouse gas emissions, physical risk, the availability of water, the questions of well, physical risk I mentioned. Broadly, I'm probably forgetting things, but this is how I would talk about that. And you know, when I hear a number of data frameworks that are available to you know, finance, which says an airline has a huge impact on nature. Yeah, okay, yes, the airline is creating lots of greenhouse gases, but we're not going to quantify that. The point is, how many greenhouse gases can you use sustainable aviation fuel? It's a climate issue. It's a greenhouse gas issue, as opposed to a broader nature issue, which is much more diffuse and impossible to answer quickly. And the other, so the nature aspect, is the questions of pollution, i.e. non-greenhouse gas related pollution, the overuse of natural resources, whether it's food overfishing, overproduction, or the overuse of water or any other natural resources, all the questions of land use change and things that are in your supply chain, plus the impact of the agriculture, which is also a huge impact, but little bit like microaggressions. And so I'd use an example to illustrate all this. Is a fast food chain dependent on nature? Yes, they sell food, typically potatoes, chicken, beef, fish, etc. The question is, you know, if you separate climate from nature, is there enough water to grow potatoes? That's physical risk. Is the potato plant at risk of becoming extinct? That is a nature risk. And though the answer to those are completely different. One is a question of supply chain management. You move the place where you buy potatoes from. The other one is a fundamental question about your business model. Okay, maybe potatoes going extinct is too harsh, but more sustainable potatoes is a question, because at some point the population is going to require it. It might actually be an advantage if you start marketing your fries as being more sustainable than the competitors. So that's how you can think about it. There's also a lot of talk about transition risk. On climate, it's clear, because there is carbon regulation, carbon price, etc. There is regulations that will make certain products obsolete at some point. On nature specifically, it's a little difficult to imagine, because there is the regulation is much weaker. There is no price on nature. In certain aspects, there is risk. In others, there isn't. But that doesn't mean that because you can't put your finger on it, that it's not there. And therefore, the question is, how do you think about these things? Have you assessed it? And there are some things that need to be dealt with now, some maybe tomorrow, and some at some point later. It doesn't mean the risk is not there, but it's less tackleable, if that word exists, now. And so really, as you see, we expect, as you can hear, we expect really to start breaking down the issue. When people say, oh, well, you need to identify your opportunities, the risk, etc. Yeah, break it down, because otherwise the task may be then daunting, a little abstract. So break it down into bits and pieces, and then tackle it one piece at a time. You might say, if you're a fast food company, well, what is the risk of potato becoming extinct? Well, okay, maybe that's very difficult to define. But what is the risk associated with selling fish that is not MSC certified, i.e. Marine Stewardship Council, which is a mark or a standard about more sustainable fish? There is risk there. There is increasing reputational risk. You might be having legal risks. And so you really need to think about all these things broken down into pieces.
Thank you, Bertrand. Yeah, it's important. It's daunting, but breaking it down is key. Lisa and Joy, I may, unless you had a pressing thought, just conscious of time and want to make sure we've got time at the end. So do jump in now if you wanted to feed in on that question.
Just very briefly, I will note that the opinion uses the TNFD and the ISSB and ISO definition of nature, which encompasses climate risk. And nature-related risk is very focused on the threats, the effects of uncertainty posed to an organization that arise from its and wider society's dependencies and impacts on nature. So while they're treated like that from definitional purposes, it may be very prudent, as Bertrand said, to chunk them into manageable portions to address them from a governance and oversight perspective. And I certainly see the reasonableness in doing so for that purpose, but note that they're both included in the concept. Climate-related nature risks are included in the concept and the definitions of nature and nature-related risk.
Thank you. It's an important point to make. I think we're focused today on the nature aspect, but of course, when we say nature-related risks, that also includes climate. Joy, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, thanks, Clara. Similar to what Lisa just said, when we talk about nature-related opportunities, they are through the TNFD's framework that changes are affected whether or not you are trying to sustainably manage your dependencies on nature, avoid, reduce those negative impacts, or develop or expand positive impacts on nature, or manage your risks. Any one of those. It goes through the drivers of change. Those drivers of change are the five themes that are really driving biodiversity loss as science told us, and one of them is climate change. So we tried to break down this idea of what are opportunities into manageable pieces. If you think about it, you have to identify a potential opportunity, you have to get that approved, financed, and then you have to implement it. And when you think about it that way, it doesn't really matter whether it's for nature or climate. Under the TNFD definition, it is an activity that is going to benefit both the organization pursuing the opportunity as well as nature. And if you identify it in terms of, as I said, managing your relationship with nature, then moving on to the approval and the implementation stage, that kind of covers everything, but in manageable chunks. So our new report, which is on opportunities, does try to put framing and discussion around that to help that conversation, which relevant to today's webinar for boards, the board can support that, that process through the questions they ask in the boardroom to management, to help management understand that nature-related opportunities, they're a little bit of a special beast. They're not nicely packaged the way potentially some other commercial opportunities are. So please, we hope that we provided some support for breaking this down into manageable, implementable chunks.
Thank you. And we're actually coming to opportunities now. It's the next question. But before I give you the floor back on the important subjects that is opportunities, I think we've got a second polling question for the audience, which is, if you could let us know what's the greatest hurdle that your organization faces when you're integrating nature risks and opportunities. Is it limited data? Is it a lack of internal expertise, competing priorities, unclear financial incentive, limited board or executive engagement, other? Please let us know. We'd love to hear from you. So back to opportunities, Joy, you already touched on this. You mentioned the latest TNFD paper on opportunities. And nature loss, it's true, it's often seen as a risk, or increasingly seen as a risk, but there is an important piece of the puzzle there that is opportunity. Do you, beyond sort of risk mitigation, could you share with us some compelling business or investment opportunities that are emerging, or maybe some key insights from the paper, even though I think you already gave some good insights there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll keep it short because I know we want to get to some Q&A as well. In the paper, it's really centered around 16 different case studies on opportunities. And what we found was it did range everything from like small startups all the way to large companies, either trying something new within the company, pivoting, adapting known technology or services. So as I said, nature-related opportunities is really a broad concept, and that's part of the problem with trying to get our hands around it because it means so many different things. So what I would say, again, relevant to this webinar, a couple of the insights is that a lot of these opportunities are identified and championed from the bottoms up within the company. So those individual champions who might be like not even heads or directors, but like an actual person doing the procurement, for example, those people need to somehow be able to bring that idea towards senior management. So again, if the board is asking questions of senior management about how the company is managing its relationship with nature, that then gives management a signal that they can find these champions, or that they can create a route for these ideas within the company. So that was something that we found when we looked at the case studies. The other ones too is that regardless of what we were looking at, from small operations to really big operations, and that is both in corporates and financials, often there would need to be some sort of pilot or proof of concept before scaling, which is no surprise. And so having, again, the board asking these questions and having room in the company and in the corporate strategy for innovation, having the budget, having the approval process for these types of things are really, really helpful. At the moment, we found that nature-related opportunities are still, as I mentioned, a broad concept. It's not very cohesive. And so to engender activity in this area, allowing for these types of things, these identifications, raising it from the bottom up, allowing for pilots and proof of concepts, they're all things that are needed to move this conversation into the mainstream. But as I said, 16 different case studies and a number of other examples from both corporates and financial institutions across, I think it was 16 economic sectors, or 12 economic sectors. I always get those numbers mixed up, but multiple economic sectors. So there should be something in there for almost everyone.
Thank you so much, and pointing everyone joining, if you'd like to check out some of the resources that we've mentioned, do visit the engagement tools section in the player. I will just move briefly to the polling results. I think we've got almost half of participants who've answered. So lack of expertise, internal expertise or capacity, competing priorities are coming out on top as the greatest hurdles. But then it's an even spread with the lack of financial incentives or business case. Joy, you touched on that. And then limited data or metrics, we know that's a big issue. And perhaps surprisingly, and it's good news that limited board or executive engagement is quite low, I think that's encouraging. We are slightly behind, but still on time to take questions at the end. So do drop questions in if you haven't done so already. Our final question before we move to the Q&A is to each of you, and thank you again for your insights today. I know it's hard to summarize these complex topics into small answers, but if there was one key takeaway from this discussion that you could leave directors or management members in attendance today with, what would it be? And Bertrand, perhaps I'll start with you.
Also, don't be daunted and start. Break it down and start. Have a conversation.
That's very succinct, but it sounds, yeah, it's very memorable. Thank you. And Joy?
I would say, although this poll is showing that it's not board engagement, I would say get more detailed, get the education needed to really dive into some of these topics.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, Lisa?
I would very self-servingly say, read the opinion, which has been done for you by CCLI, and use it liberally and judiciously throughout the organization.
Thank you. I think there's a lot of practical and then legal analysis and then practical resources that are coming out. And again, it can be hard to keep up, but hopefully this webinar helps you know what you should put next on your reading list. I'll move to the Q&A section now. I know that there is a very good question that I think I'd like to address first. It's for Bertrand and Joy specifically. And then we'll have a question for you, Lisa, on the legal risks. How are boards approaching the topic of quantifying nature-related risks?
I can go first if you like, because this topic actually came up in our team meeting today. So I feel I can actually try and answer this one. The TNFD put out our status report, our very first status report, actually a couple weeks ago. And part of what was looked at was what were the metrics that were being used. So, you know, the metrics within the disclosure report are often those, they often are signed off by the board, et cetera. And we found that actually there was a lot of metrics being used on very specific water, of course, on climate. And that's because there has been focus on those metrics historically through CDP and through, many organizations on climate. However, what it also found was that there was a number of metrics that respondents said were very feasible to start collecting. Things like plastic, spatial footprints, extent of water use. And so we think there's a real opportunity there to start to look at some of these other metrics. Additionally, as firms start to do more TNFD disclosure, there's a whole host of core metrics that have been recommended by TNFD, as well as a number of sector metrics. So there's quite a bit of information out there that can help boards look at hard data around some of the risks.
Yeah. I'll add very little because what Joy said was quite comprehensive, but I think the underlying thing is break it down into pieces and apply the right metrics. Often there are things that are not quantifiable. Don't try, there's no point. But a lot of it can be, especially when it comes to climate, water, physical risks. There's plenty of tools that are readily available.
Thank you, Bertrand. We've got a question on greenwashing, Lisa, that I think you perhaps will be best placed to answer, although do jump in if you have thoughts. So there are a lot of conversations about greenwashing and green hushing when it comes to nature and climate. How can companies mitigate the risks that are associated with greenwashing and green hushing?
Yeah, I think this is a fairly straightforward proposition. in terms of stay factual, tell or disclose to entities what you are doing, what you are finding, without making bold marketing type claims. I would note that we do have changes through the budget of 2 weeks ago that have amended Bill C-59, the amendments to the Competition Act, to attempt to ameliorate some of the overzealous claims against entities that are rightfully and righteously taking action in relation to nature-related risk. And I think putting it in the context of regular financial reporting parameters like enterprise risk management, like supply chains, like stakeholders and rights holders, is an easy and appropriate way to go about things.
Claire,
Thank
can I
you.
comment on this question as well?
Of course, please.
Because I just want to mention one of the case studies we looked at for the opportunities work, the proponent actually tackled this head on because they found that their product that they were producing was being used for claims, for greenwashing claims. And so they had to start an entire data-driven process for themselves so that they knew which data they had and they didn't have, and which claims they could support and they couldn't support. So it was a very interesting case study to take a look at. And this idea of piloting or proof of concepts, also another idea that has come up in a different case study, where again the proponent did that so that they would be solid on what they could claim that it did and didn't do. So data is really one of the cornerstones for that.
And I think if we're looking to, what additional steps governments could take, we do see governments like Australia creating safe harbors for certain types of nature-related action or climate-related action, to allow companies to act without fear of reprisal when they do look at and examine the data, as Joy rightfully states, and or the risks and contingencies associated with nature.
Thank you so much. I think we will wrap the session because we've addressed most questions in the chat. I wanted to thank our brilliant panelists again for taking the time. It's a busy week. I know some of you have other commitments, work related or even speaking at other events. So thank you again. We really appreciate your presence. And I wanted to thank again GARP for co-hosting this session. I do encourage you to check out the GARP Toronto, Montreal, or indeed their international chapters, as Louise mentioned. And thank you also to the ISF and to the TNFD for co-organizing and supporting the session. We encourage you one more time, we have a reading list for you all that's available in the engagement tools. And before you drop off, we had a final polling question, and I would be very curious, and maybe there will be some follow-up based on your answers to, after today's discussion, how likely are you to take steps to strengthen your organization's approach to nature-related risks and opportunities? Are you very likely, somewhat likely, unlikely, unsure? Please let us know, and that informs us for future events and future resources. Thank you again to all of you. Louise, I will hand over back to you from some closing words.
Thank you very much, Clara. Appreciate it. And I don't have many closing words other than, again, to thank our speakers, Natalie, Lisa, Joy, and Bertrand, for their informative discussion. And thank you as well to GARP members and to all of you who turned out this evening to join us online. We hope you enjoyed the discussion and look forward to seeing you at a future GARP webcast event or chapter meeting that's upcoming near you soon. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening.